Welcome to Something to Say, where we bring voices from diverse backgrounds who will share their unique stories and perspectives on finding their passion and provide insights on how you can find yours. Join us as host Greg DeShields guides us through this enlightening journey.
Welcome to another episode of Something to Say podcast, a unique platform that amplifies the voices of individuals from various backgrounds sharing their passion. I'm your host, Greg DeShields, and I'm pleased to bring you this exciting conversation today. We're excited to have the opportunity to welcome Patrice Lumumba-Jones, who's a partner and chief creative officer at Enlight Media and DEI Context. Now, DEI Context is a video-based online program that effectively integrates history into your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, empowering your organization to be a force for change. The award-winning debut collection, Patterns of American Racism, focuses on anti-Black racism in the United States. Patrice started his journey in the world of higher education, publishing with Prentice Hall Publishing in 1995. Fueled by a deep love for education, a knack for messaging, and a talent for forging emotional connections with customers, he ascended from sales rep to marketing manager to director of marketing and ultimately to vice president of marketing at Pearson. He embraced a new role at Pearson as VP head of creative for higher education. The higher ed creative team he built transformed how Pearson developed and promoted customer-centric video content. He had risen to VP Global Creative, collaborating with new global communication and marketing group. The murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri was a turning point for Patrice, recognizing his responsibility to advocate for change. Patrice began blogging and speaking out against systemic racism in the United States. His extensive career in publishing led him to co-found Enlight Media in 2019, allowing him to continue creating video content that resonates emotionally with students and instructors, fostering enriching educational experiences and lifelong love of learning. Following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, Patrice dedicated himself to intertwining Enlight Media's mission with a drive for social justice. Today, he is immersed in writing, directing, and producing content that not only inspires a love of learning, but also ignites a sense of purpose. Patrice resides in Harlem with his partner Allison and their dog roommate Huey. We have to talk about that. So Patrice, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Something to Say.
Hey, it's great to be here. I'm excited.
So I'm really anxious to begin our conversation, but you have such a distinctive name. I'm anxious for you to tell a little bit of the story about your middle name, Lumumba.
All right. So I was named after Patrice Lumumba, who was the first prime minister of an independent Congo. And you have to understand, I was born in 1967 to activist academic parents. And at that time, every kid on my block had an African name. In fact, there was another Lumumba 2 blocks down from me. His name was Lumumba Willingham.
Interesting.
It wasn't really that distinctive to me as I was growing up when I was younger, but as I went on and went to college and grad school and into the world of work, I think it was a little bit more unusual. But it was also interesting that I did some pre-dissertation research in Kenya, and people would find out that my name was Lumumba and open their homes to me. There has always been a little bit of tension between African Americans and Africans, particularly in Africa. And sometimes they view you with a little bit of skepticism, but the minute they found out my name was Lumumba, I think the phrase I heard was, "Oh, you are a forward-thinking Black American." So, it has served me well, and it's also given me a sense of purpose.
Well, it is quite distinctive, one that makes it easy to remember, and I think is a bit of a badge of honor to wear the way you do. So now I want to go a little bit deeper in this conversation with you. And one of the things that really struck out for me as I was reading through your bio is how you've been able to merge education, media, communication, and social justice. And as a result of that, it makes me want to add a little bit more insight to our audience to know just who you are as a person. So when we do our podcast here on Something to Say, we like to begin with some get to know you questions. It's a great way
Mhm.
for our audience to have a better appreciation of who you are. And we begin with some icebreaker questions, and then we'll get into telling your story, and then we'll talk a little bit more deeper about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if you're ready, we'll give you your first question as an icebreaker. So are you up for it?
Yeah, I'm down.
Okay. So your first question, if you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would that be and why?
All right. So I hope I'm not like spilling the tea here, but I knew this question was coming, and I thought about it a lot. And originally, I thought about people like James Baldwin, Angela Davis, who I did get to meet, but I did not have dinner with.
Wow.
Fred Hampton, but ultimately, I landed on Clifton Jones Sr., who is my grandfather. Clifton Jones Sr. was born in 1897. He died in 1979 at 82. And so I didn't know him, but I only knew him in the way that a young child knows an elder. The conversation I want to have with him now is nothing like any conversation I got to have with him as a child. The interesting thing about Granddaddy Clifton was that he was known as a race man in a way in the 1930s and 40s, which is very different than being a race than what being a race man meant in the 60s and 70s, and certainly what it means now in the age of social media. And so the bravery that it took to take some of the stances that were described to me that he took during a time where like lynching didn't even necessarily make the paper is fascinating to me. One of the things, the other thing about him, so he was the pastor of the AME church in Oakdale, Louisiana. He also was a union leader, the biggest employer in Oakdale, Louisiana, when my father was growing up, and also, my grandfather was there, was the sawmill. And Granddaddy Clifton was one of the union leaders at the sawmill. And what my father told me is that when the union bosses would come to town, they would have to meet with the union leaders, and they always would tell my grandfather, "Well, meet us here or meet us there. Here's where we're going to be." And he would insist that they came to his house in the hardwood section. That's what the neighborhood was known as in Oakdale. And he felt that this was because it established his credibility and the fact that he was, as much of a man as a union official as anyone else, that he's not shuffling off to wherever they want him to meet hat in hand, but he's hosting them at his house, a place where this is his domain. And I thought that was really interesting way to look at it, and just, because people had to find these little ways to resist in the 30s and 40s, and that was one of the things that he did. And another story I was told was that there was a time where, like, and Oakdale has a really interesting history. My Uncle Frank sends me stuff all the time about, like, it was fraught with this kind of level of contention because Black folks in Oakdale just didn't lay down. It's not that, there was still segregation, there was things you couldn't do, but there was not a lot of kowtowing going on. And so my dad told me there was one time where, like, a group of young white boys would ride around in this car, and they would, like, throw trash onto Black people's yards and on their porches, and they did it when my grandfather was home, and he took that trash and went down to the square in town where the white men would congregate, and he threw that trash at their feet and
Wow.
said, "If your boys do this again, they won't be coming home." And he went back home, and my grandmother thought he was crazy. She was, she was, like, batting down the hatches, but he had come to this understanding or the peace with himself that there was just some things he would not tolerate, and that whatever the consequences were, they were better than being put into that box of disrespect. So I would have loved to have talked to him about that and just to boy his outlook on the world, and I would be really fascinated to see what his thoughts are about the world today and where we are.
Amazing. So, you're the first, as many times as we've asked that question, you're the first person to really, connect it to a family member. And
Really?
yeah, and it's interesting how you have such clarity and connection to your to your family history and ancestors. And that type of conversation today, because of the connection to a family member, just gives you even greater clarity of who you are as a person,
Yeah.
based on those who were before you. And the clarity that you have in terms of telling the story about them is pretty amazing too. So, kudos to you. That was a great response.
I'm curious though that more people don't think of family, just because of the kind of, the connection. And I guess we are kind of a celebrity obsessed culture at some level. Anyway, that's interesting to me.
Well,
I would
we
not think I would be unique in that regard.
I mean, we've had some really impressive people, you know, we've
Okay.
had, Jesus has actually come up 3 or 4 times.
Jesus is big, man. Jesus is huge.
Martin Luther King, I think, has certainly,
Yeah.
been amongst those, so but I'm really glad that you were able to draw the family connection because that is something that as you think about how we navigate our lives today, the greater clarity that we have to who we are as a person and our ancestors and the history of why I think the way I do and why I feel the way I do, makes a big difference in how you carry forward.
Yeah.
All right, so here's another one. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this question. Do
Mhm.
you love your future or your past more?
The tough word there is love, right? It's easier to love something that's tangible, and I think your past is more tangible. But I'm excited about the future. I feel like there's this compound interest kind of thing that happens with all your experience and travels and things you've done and things you've learned that increase the impact that you're going to have moving forward more so than the impact you were able to have in your past.
Right.
And so as I look, so my answer would be, aside from the word love, my preference is for the future. I'm excited about what my experience can bring to bear on the problems that I face now. I'm excited about, I think, the wisdom that I've acquired, and how I'm going to be able to apply that to, some challenges that lie ahead that could be daunting. But at the same time, so far, the older I've gotten, I think the more authority I carry, for lack of a better term, right? The more respect I command. And I can figure out, I have to figure out how to use that, to make a bigger difference. And I'm also a lot more clear about what goals I have in terms of the impact that I want to have and the things that I think are important to address. And so I think that focus alone should allow me to, do things that I'm proud of, looking back on what is now the future, but will also one day be the past.
I think that, reflection on how your past has really built this repertoire of experiences that you can really dive into to make the future even that much more meaningful to you is amongst the ways that most people look at this particular question and how they're able
Mhm.
to connect that to what they're able to do as they look forward. The less experience you have may make it hard to fall in love with what comes next for you, but
Yeah.
I agree. I think that idea of leveraging the experience that you have, makes it better for you as you, look down the road. All right, so here's another one. You're the perfect person for some of these icebreakers because you certainly have this way of looking at things from, a very practical but a very intellectual perspective. So, here's your next question. Who is the most influential person in your life, and how did they impact you?
All right, I'm going family again. And Barbara Ann Posey Jones, who is my mother. And both of my parents have been very influential in my life, but they're both still alive and they both still provide me a lot of guidance and inspiration. But my mother, it's funny, when I was younger, I didn't know this. I knew that she was very compassionate, but what I didn't have a sense of was her bravery, and her competitiveness. And she kind of instilled some of that in me, or at least some of it. I don't think I'm anywhere near as brave as her, and I may not be as competitive as her. And I'll tell you a story about that. But my mother was the leader of the first student-led sit-in in America in Oklahoma City, and in I think 1953. And she just recently received an honorary degree from the University of Oklahoma.
Oh, congrats.
Um, because as a result of that, and they brought her in, and and she was 15 at the time. And the reason that the NAACP, she was working with the NAACP, Clara Luper, who is a civil rights leader and activist from that area of the country, but they needed students to lead these sit-in movements because if they went to jail, they didn't lose their jobs, right? Because they were teenagers, they were kids. But my mother wasn't just a figurehead. She actually was like leading this movement and rallying the troops and making sure people were where they needed to be. And the thing that I learned and it's I'm 56 years old and I'm just learning this is that these sit-ins were every day until the store owners relented.
Right.
So it was like sit-in season, you know
Right.
what I mean? And so that kind of commitment at that age to understand the importance of what you were doing and not wanting to go be with your friends or all the other things that teenagers would want to do, but to be dedicated and kind of drive that kind of change. Yeah, my mother is amazing. And the other thing I'll tell you about my mom and her competitiveness. So my mother was dean of business at Alabama A&M. She was dean of business at Prairie View. She was chair of the political of the economics department at Clark Atlanta University. It was Clark College then before it became Clark Atlanta.
Right.
And while she was, I think this was at Alabama A&M, she called me from the hospital. And I'm like, What's going on?" She said, "Well, we were playing softball." Now, my mom's in her 60s at this point, and she got out there, she's Dean Jones, she gets up to bat, and she says all the guys in the outfield started coming in close and playing in on the infield grass because she's clearly not gonna hit it that far. My mother hit the ball over the left fielder's head, and she's running to first, she's running to second, and she thinks she can get a triple. So my mother's running from second base to third base, pulls her hamstring, falls on her shoulder, breaks her collarbone,
Wow.
at which point she crawls on the ground back to second base. And before she says anything about being hurt, she just yells, "I'm safe."
Truly a very competitive person, right?
Safe. Oh man, I think about that all the time, man. And she just whatever she's doing, she's trying to win it. She is not playing around. You know, anything you play with her, if you play gin, spades, she plays bid whist. Like my mom's here to take the trophy home every time. Every time.
Wow. It's interesting as I hear you tell those stories. It's almost like I should just have a separate podcast for you to talk about your family because you truly have an incredible family story to share.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting for me as you talk about the work that she did with the NAACP, and I know recently there was a movie that came out that featured a lot of those who were the grassroots volunteers
Mhm.
to support those initiatives. And while things like what you've described may, for some, seem to have been a completely, non-significant component, they were really relevant factors to build the foundation of the bigger work that was taking place.
Yes.
So amazing. And I remember there was a segment that was talked about how they organized those,
Mhm.
and trying to engage, that younger demographic to understand the importance of what their number one volunteer service means and how it contributes to the bigger picture. So that's a pretty amazing story that you told. I kind of knew that you would bring all of it to that question, but I wasn't sure it was going to be like that. So but I do want to talk about your personal story because it brings a lot to the conversation. We've
Mhm.
certainly learned a lot about your passion, but I want to maybe move to a question that for individuals like you, this has certainly resonated in people understanding the relationships that you establish. So, how big is your inner circle and what does that really mean to you?
Not big. Not big. I think one of the things that I'm not really good at is traveling along with my relationships. I've lived in a lot of places. I've lived in Atlanta, I've lived in Baton Rouge, I've lived in Memphis, I've lived in Houston, I've lived in Jersey, I now live in Harlem. And there are a few people that I have maintained contact with. And obviously I'm close with my family. But like I don't have any friends from high school that I am, in touch with. There are people, if I go to Atlanta and I see them, I'm like, oh, hey, what's going on? But they're not people that I feel really connected to. I have a couple of friends from college that I stay in touch with, and then some folks that I've uh, made friends with over the course of work, who I jump, I'm on the phone with and talking to, and I've maintained those relationships with. And I think the thing about that I know this is a flaw in the way I feel about things is my perception of like someone that I went to high school with. I know I've grown a lot and I've changed a lot. I'm a very different person now than I was when I was in high school. But when I imagine those people, because I haven't been in touch, I still see them as the same person that I went to high school with. So when you're like, "Oh, should I call so and so?" I'm like, Why would I want to talk? He's probably not talking about anything or whatever." But he's not 17 anymore. She's not 17 anymore. So if I do see those folks, I'm happy to see them. But I didn't maintain those relationships, and so I do think that this isn't a question, but if you had something that you would do differently or do over again, I think I would have made it a point to kind of stay in touch with more people. But then again, I don't know how many people you can really be tight with at once. There's what is it, the rule of like 30? You can only have 30 close
Absolutely.
friends.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I'm probably somewhere around 20,
Wow.
at the most, maybe 15. But that said, I don't feel like I have a hole in my life. But I do think it would be nice to kind of be in touch with, some people
Well, it's
that I'm not.
interesting because as I asked various leaders, as they get older, it gets smaller and smaller, and a lot
Yeah,
of that is about who you really have trust with and
yeah.
who you really feel will honestly critique you and compliment you in terms of
Mhm.
how you approach through your life. So, you're at that age, as you kind of alluded to, where it gets a little bit clearer as to what is the
Yeah,
significant role of an inner circle and just maybe how small it really needs to be relevant to you as a person. But you've done
yeah.
some amazing work and you've been involved with some incredible organizations. So it really lends itself to getting a response to you from this next question. What legacy do you hope to leave behind?
I think legacy is a somewhat overused word, right? Everybody doesn't really get a legacy as we think about it. But I think in terms of what is it, how do you want to be remembered? I think is a question that is kind of more relevant to more people. Everybody doesn't get a legacy, and I would be thrilled to have a legacy. I don't know what it would be, but how I want to be remembered, I want to be remembered by the way I make people feel. And I know there's some anecdote about that, but I
Right,
think that even when it happens now, right? There are people that have managed in different capacities, whether it be creatives or marketers, and they'll bring something up to me that I said to them one day and that they still think about it. Like that to me, that makes me feel um fulfilled to a certain extent of knowing that I had an impact on people that they remember when I'm not there. Right. And it's something that they can call on and that motivates them towards something positive. And so I had there was a woman that worked for me that said she had wrote out a book of what she called patricisms, like things that I would say that she, remember. And what's so funny is when you look at the stuff that she was attributing to me, I was like, 80% is this is my dad's material, clearly. You know what I mean? That I didn't know where you thinking of. 'Cause my dad would say stuff to me, like, if you don't know where it is, you don't know where it ain't. Stuff like that. But at
right,
the same time, my dad's a political scientist, right? And he has some very profound thoughts about the way the world worked and what we need to do. I interviewed him probably 10 years ago, and he's 87 now. And I asked him if there's anything that you learned about the world, or that you think differently about now than you did when you were younger. And again, my dad is the penultimate race man, right? And he said, "What I've learned is that I should not be so hard on Black folks who have to make concessions in order to feed their families. But I need to be even harder on Black folks who act in interests that are contrary to the interests of Black people."
Black people. Oh.
and that really struck me because we were talking about a friend of mine who worked for a oil and gas company who was making donations to right-wing political small political organizations, right-wing organizations, because his employer monitored their contributions. And so because he wanted to make larger donations to some other causes, he felt he needed to balance that out, at least in terms of number of organizations,
Mhm.
in order to keep his job.
Wow.
And I heard that, and my first thought was, "Man, that is sellout stuff." And I didn't say that to him because he's a dear friend of mine, but I that's kinda how I was trying to make sense of it because I know him on so many different levels, and I'm not gonna I didn't judge him as a person because I know him as a person. I know the total person,
Right.
but it didn't fit for me. And my dad kinda talked me through that. He's like, "Look, man, this dude's got 2 kids in college, and not cheap colleges. Got one at Cornell, one at University of Maryland. He's got to do what he's got to do to take care of his people first, but you know him, you know what he's about. And so that to me, like that kind of advice is advice I hope that I can give someone else,
Well, that's
that they can
excellent
call on.
legacy, as you think of, valuable insights and perspectives that you can pass on to people because
Yep.
it certainly reinforces to not necessarily take people for face value. And there is a
Right.
story behind the story behind the story. And often when I am engaged in a podcast, you also learn from people that there's a story behind the story. Like you may have this,
Hmm.
initial interpretation as you kind of describe that individual, the priorities that they have in terms of their life, who do you love the most and what would you do? That really
Yeah.
kind of comes into play. And a lot of times we don't know that. But I do want to get more into this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's
Yes.
so much happening with that. And as an industry, and certainly the way that you kind of laid the foundation in terms of the depth of knowledge that you have, and certainly the experiences that you've had in your career, I'm anxious to get your response to a few of these questions. So I
Sure.
want to pull through these because I know there's some additional questions that you gave, but the audience would undoubtedly want to hear your response to it. So the first one, if it's not heavy enough, let's just keep building on top of it, is what are the most significant trends or developments that you see happening in diversity, equity, and inclusion right now?
I see the resistance. I see the pushback on DEI efforts as very significant right now. I think that the groundswell of support for DEI following the murder of George Floyd um, brought with it the inevitable pushback, blowback, pendulum swing back the other way. And I am the thing that amazes me more than the pushback is the people who seem surprised by the pushback. I think that it is very clear that if there were not resistance to DEI, there would not be a need for DEI,
Mm.
right? And so this is engaging in DEI efforts is engaging in a struggle, right? It is not an inner struggle, it's an outer struggle. It's a struggle against those who would like to keep the status quo in play. And so, when those people or those organizations get their stuff together and all right, they're ready to push back, right? Because they after George Floyd, they really didn't have anything to say. It was too raw. It was too in your face that we saw a police officer slow motion strangle someone in the street as children begged for him to stop, and he didn't. And we all saw it. And all of a sudden, there was nothing to say. There was no excuses. And it feels like those people who are anti DEI or social justice just had to chill, right? And those people who were in the middle or they really weren't advocates for it felt like they had to say something, right? And so you got all these companies making these really bold statements. The thing that struck me about it was I had never heard a company or well, maybe some nonprofits, but I had never heard like a major corporate entity talk about institutional racism or systemic racism. They were big on bigotry,
Right.
fighting bigotry, finding those rare bad apples and plucking them out so that we can all prosper.
Right.
But there was something about the George Floyd murder, which we also have to be clear was coming on the heels of Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Gurley. I forgot what his first name was in New York. But there's so many, Philando Castile. All this stuff happened leading into George Floyd. So it was kind of like we were focusing on it, we were talking about it, the denials of, "Oh, but did you see that he reached?" or "The policeman doesn't know what he's doing." But, those excuses were getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and then there was this incontrovertible incident.
Right.
And so I thought that was a very special moment in time where people had to acknowledge that there was something bigger than individual prejudice happening. And so I think that the blowback to that is really interesting because there's also a lot of people who were saying that they had seen the light, have now, quietly slid back into the darkness and are letting us then fight this fight that they had pledged to be a part of.
It's interesting you talk about the pendulum, and I can remember in the early 2000s, a conversation at a program that was being produced around DEI, and there was a cautionary discussion about pendulum and that it can
Mhm,
swing one way and it can swing completely the other way. And that will the conversation was about we'll move to a period where the work that we're doing in DEI will make us feel good and it'll be easy, essentially.
mhm.
But that the further we push in that direction, it'll go in the opposite, and that
Yep.
the true hard work, the true painful work, true ugly aspect of this work will be even that much clearer, and it will certainly separate those who are truly committed to,
Mhm.
what DEI means, from those who have just kind of, jumped on because of the opportunities that were associated with it, so,
You know
yeah,
what I think? I think it's a pendulum to those who aren't involved, to those who aren't affected. For those who are in it, it's a tug of war,
it's a tug of war, yes.
right? And if you let go of the rope, we know what happens.
Absolutely. So let me move on because there's another question that I think is extremely relevant as we talk about this. So, what are some of the common misconceptions that you'd like to clear up that appears in this work around DEI?
I have one,
Okay.
and that is the misconception is that advocating for evil is okay if you call it politics, right? If you believe that I am subhuman and not entitled to the same rights as someone else because of my skin color, that's not politics, right? That's oppression. That's evil. And so what we find is that people can present these really extreme views and they get adopted by some, respected organization. And all of a sudden, oh, now it's politics. Or a candidate adopts these views and puts them out there. Oh, it's now politics. So, when you start to call people out on these beliefs, you will have a right to my political beliefs. But I'm like, why is this political now when it's basic human rights? And so I think we need to, and that's the normalization process, right? And that's how really foul stuff gets into the mainstream is that it finds some other banner to live under that's more accepted. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed. And we cannot let that stuff just fly by under the banner of politics.
Well, you certainly bring up an interesting point in the evolution of how politics and social issues become intertwined. And
Hmm.
as a society, it's really important for us to be able to educate ourselves to know the difference between the two and how
Yep.
we look at the world and the decisions we make. So this one may seem odd, but maybe not as much as most people might think. So can you highlight some specific innovation or breakthroughs that maybe you've noticed that are somewhat exciting regarding DEI?
So I don't know if it's specific to DEI, but I am both excited and terrified by large language models, LLMs and AI, right? I think that AI presents amazing opportunities for education and to create curricula that speak to students of all different backgrounds, racially, or in terms of rural versus urban, race, um, country, wherever you live, location. So many things, right, can be bespoke, and we can cater to different learning styles, which I think is really interesting because AI gives you the ability to take what you know about someone and then instantly turn that into an application or an essay or an assignment, an example or something that appeals to that student's understanding of the world, that student's background, and that student's interests. And that's fascinating to me because we can start moving away from education that is based on one particular experience in a way that scales.
Mm.
If you ever look at like the Dana Foundation's criteria for like how to create an inclusive classroom or an inclusive learning experience, it's all great stuff, but it's stuff that's like, yeah, if I'm a teacher and I've got 9 students in my class and I've got 2 classes to teach in a day, then I can find out all this information about this student and then write these lesson plans and assignment that reflect that student's individual needs. Because it's not just about Black students, white students, Asian students, whatever.
True.
It's about what their experience has been, right? How they best learn, what they're good at, what they need to get better at. The whole idea of your purpose as a teacher is to help a student get to the point where their strengths make their weaknesses irrelevant,
Hmm.
right? And that's about figuring out what they're good at and figuring out how to leverage that to move them forward to the place that they need to be. And you got to know a lot about that student, and then you need to know how to create curricula and content that is geared towards that student.
Well, you know,
And
there's been a lot of conversation about the use of AI from a student perspective, making life
mhm,
easier and using it to write reports and things like that. But you bring up an interesting point of view of how that technology can be used to advance your teaching capability as an
right,
instructor. Not that that probably has not been an ongoing initiative within academic institutions, but I'm glad that you're giving voice to that because I'm sure there are a
yeah.
lot professors who are like, yeah, well, these are other ways that we use it effectively to be more successful with our students.
Yeah, everybody worries about cheating, and I understand it. And to some extent, the reason we have so much cheating is I think we allowed education to become transactional, particularly in higher ed. And what happens is it gets so expensive that your big question becomes, well, how am I going to get my money back? Right. And if it's about how I'm going to get my money back, then you're looking at I paid I paid X amount, $60,000 a year, 50,000, $100,000 a year to get this degree, which is then going to lead to me making how much money a year?
Right.
And that's the purpose of my education. Whereas the notion of education being the way that you learn how to learn, therefore you can continue to learn once you've moved out of the school experience, whether it be higher ed, high school, graduate, or whatever, is a very different way to look at education. And that what is the love of learning? What is the value of learning? What is the ability to look at problems and solve them throughout your life? Not just how do I apply this to getting a job and making more money? And I feel like that ship has sailed.
Right.
And so now we're like, well, if this is transactional, then why wouldn't I cheat to get the degree if the degree is all I want?
Right. And I think that that may lend itself to the issue of how pricing has been so much an influence in terms of and rankings. I mean, all of these other
Yeah.
components have really kind of driven that interpretation of the education to be more of a transaction. It gets me from here to there. And, when it was rather affordable and was clearly a pathway from here to
Yep.
there, that it served more as a path, not a transaction to say,
Right.
I mean, I remember when I went to college, it was all about how I could get into the hospitality industry, and I knew that this institution had the ability to do it. It wasn't priced
Mhm.
so exorbitantly that I would be overly concerned about how much it cost and what that price of that ticket was going to do as we move along. But, you are without any doubt, like I said, somebody I think I need to do part two because you have a lot of really good perspective on the academic side that I'd like to explore. But I do want to talk about DEI in context. So,
All right.
are very much involved with the launching of that program. Can you give a little bit more context to our audience about DEI in context?
So what DEI in context is a modular video-based educational platform that's meant to inject historical context into existing DEI training and initiatives. Because what we believe is that if we understand our history, then we understand how we got here. There's a line in this movie, The Holdovers, which is an unlikely place to find anything about DEI if you've
Mm,
ever seen it. But that Paul Giamatti makes this point that history is not just the study of the past, it's the explanation of the present. And beyond that, it can be the blueprint for the solutions of the future. That's my part about
mm,
the solutions of the future. And so I think a lot of times with DEI training that I've been involved with, or DEI task forces that I was involved with during my corporate experience, we focused so much on like how to play nice in the sandbox. Like it was this whole program on like to learn like not to touch black women's hair, stuff like that, right? And that's not the point, right? The point is to understand that these issues that we have within the workplace are part of larger systemic issues. And if you understand that they are systemic and institutional in nature, then a couple of things happen. One, you understand the kind of work that must be done and why we're here in the first place. But you also start to realize that you're not going to vote your way out of this. Individuals aren't going to stop oppression in the United States, not going to start discrimination. It's not going to fix women being, getting paid two-thirds of what men make or whatever. What's going to happen is you're going to wake up one day and realize, you know what, this big company I work for is an institution. This institution has values that they certainly hold me accountable for every day that I'm there, and even when I'm not at work. What can I do to hold the company accountable to the values that they've stated around diversity, right? Around belonging,
right.
around equity. So if we all get on the same page around understanding the nature of the problem, the size of the problem, and what's required to solve it, then we can also create some accountability between employers and employers around what we do both internally and externally to improve the situation. And that's what we're trying to do. Play a little part in that with DEI in context.
You know, what I really find significant about DEI context is it does connect that historical, point of view, which often that in a lot of the DEI initiatives is not part of the conversation. It's
Right.
like, very fragmented in terms of these are the pieces that we want you to know, but what's the historical context of how we even got there? And even
Yep.
if sometimes there is history, it's not really deep enough for people to have a real sense of, what we are engaged in. But I want to ask you this question before we go further, because I think it's incredibly important to put it into play. And if we were to play this podcast back in a year, I'm curious to find out what will be the current trend of conversation. But nevertheless, the program is called DEI in Context. What are your thoughts about the use of the word DEI as where we stand today? Is that something that should be changed? Is it something that should be modified? What are your thoughts around the use of DEI as you launch the new initiative?
So I had an interesting conversation with a woman who is the chief diversity officer at a university about 10 days ago. And she said that she went to a conference of CDOs in academia. And the big conversation they were having was what they were changing their titles to, that their universities were insisting at a minimum that they remove the word equity from their titles. Some of them didn't want diversity or inclusion in their titles. And it was driven largely by the legal department, right? Because they were concerned about I don't know what you call it now. It used to be called reverse discrimination charges, right? Because it's the political climate
Mm,
driving all of this. And she was reluctant to do so, offended by the fact that she was even having to think about it. But at the same time, she really understood that universities are are very sheepish in terms of lawsuits and litigious behavior. So for me, I am reluctant to call this product anything but DEI in context. In fact, even more reluctant now because I am Barbara Jones's child. And I feel like you're not going to chase me off my block,
Right.
right? Because we have a history of this, right? Affirmative action, right? Somebody they come out and tell you that, associate all this nonsense around why affirmative action is somehow unfair to the privileged people. Woke, right? Which is about being aware of the way that the world works and how discrimination plays out. And all of a sudden, then you get the other side decides that we're going to laugh at people who are woke and make light of the word woke. And then all of a sudden, nobody wants to be woke anymore. Critical race theory gets characterized as something that it just
Mm.
absolutely is not. Right. And then you get accused of, is that critical race theory? And you go, oh, no, it's not critical race theory. We wouldn't, I don't believe in that stuff. You don't even know what it is. But the point is, it's been characterized as negative. And rather than fight against the negative characterization, you accept it and say, oh, we got to find another word for that. And I feel like the same thing is happening now with DEI. Now, if I was making a broad based product that I wanted to appeal to everyone who had a DEI program, I would think a little bit longer about this decision.
Hmm.
But we are trying to impact purpose-driven organizations for whom DEI is part of their core values. But I do understand that the people who are making the decision or may want our product aren't necessarily people who ultimately have to sign off on our product. And if we need to put a different wrapper on our program so that this content can get in the hands of employees and employers and make a difference, then we can do that. But if you're someone who sees the word DEI and says, I'm not going to click on this find out more information button, then you're probably not the customer that's going to be interested in this product once you get into it.
Mm.
Once you see that there's a chapter on slavery that talks about the economic foundation of slavery and how that economic foundation has persisted all the way from slavery into Reconstruction, into Jim Crow, and into mass incarceration, and how it also then mirrors the patterns of housing discrimination. If you don't want to hear the word DEI, you're not going to want to watch these videos anyway.
Right.
So I would much rather have the person like the faculty member I talked to that may very well have to change her title reluctantly, but she's still eager to hear more about DEI in context because it reflects her values and her beliefs. And we can figure out how to work around the nomenclature.
Right. It's interesting because so much of, and as I continue to have, conversations with you and Monica about this particular project, the context part is really where the substance exists.
Mhm,
And while DEI kind of puts you on earth, you kind of get zeroed in on exactly where you are and what you're talking about when you begin to put it into context. And that's what this really is
yeah,
about. A lot of the components that you've described, quite frankly, for those who want some historical perspective in order to base their decisions about going forward.
mhm,
But I mean, I think you were quite eloquent in describing it, but I did want to at least add some perspective from my point of view, and that it really emphasizes more about how all of this is put into context. And this
mhm.
is a great resource for you to be able to do it. Whether you call it DEI or IEE or whatever you call it, it's about how it all really kind of is put into context. So,
Yeah.
all right. So, one more question, because I do want to be mindful of our time, because I do want to hear what you have to say, as I'm sure you probably have some important things about it. But this is another question around DEI that comes up often. So, there is a tendency to define the potential of DEI in terms of profit. So,
Mhm.
what is your vision or what's your ultimate upside as it relates to it? Is it more really centered upon, and I know we've talked about, whether we call it the business case or the business outcome, but, where do you sit on that point of view around it serving as a result for profit?
S So I believe all the literature that diverse workforces are more productive. You have more diversity of ideas, therefore you have more innovation, which leads to making more money, all of that. But I think that's an intermediate goal, right? It's a nice to have. It is something to get certain people in the organization. particularly leadership, excited. But going back to what I said before, the way that we learn how to engage with other people as adults is largely through work. We learn a lot, say organizations like churches talk a lot about how you should treat other people, but you're only getting there once a week and nobody's checking to see if you're actually doing the stuff that was in the lesson.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Whereas in the workplace, companies roll out all the time. This is our code of conduct. This is what we believe in. You're responsible to act this way while you're here. And by the way, if we hear about you not acting this way somewhere else and it gets back to us, you can get fired for that. And
Right.
my point is that companies have the ability to lay out a preferred kind of behavior and values, and then to a certain extent, enforce that or reinforce that through the kind of policies that they implement around things, everything ranging from your hiring policies to your performance appraisal policies to your promotion. Like all of this stuff is reinforced by the values that a company puts forward.
Mm.
So I think they have immense ability to shape the way that we engage with each other outside of the workplace, right? Because we spend, 8, 10 hours at work every day. And if we treat people with respect there, are we going to go home and be disrespectful, or is some of that going to spill over and impact the way that we view our communities and the way we behave within our community? So for me, the upside, the ultimate upside of DEI is a way of training all of us how to respect each other.
Mm. It's interesting you bring that up because a few years ago, I was working with a resource group, and their interest was to find out how organizations that have successful DEI programs that has made a difference in their organization, whether it generated more profit or positive work environment. But they
Mhm.
also wanted to find out what kind of impact that it was having in their community. Like,
Right.
did the community of which, for example, their employees return home? So, do they volunteer more? Do they find that they have a tendency to be more participative in initiatives? But the idea is, can I take what I do so successfully within my organization and have
Mhm.
that become an influence in the community of which where we operate our business and where our employees live? So, you bring up a really good point because I think for organizations that do it well, whether they make money or not, it's like how they can
Mhm.
take all of that effort and have it impact the communities that people live. So,
I think understanding the history contributes to the likelihood that what you learn through a DEI lens at work gets transferred in the community, because the history isn't about what's happening in your office. The history is about how the world works, and you start to see things that you didn't see before, particularly in terms of the economic relationships that are reinforced through oppression.
uh,
And if you start to see these things around you, then what are you going to tell your kids about that?
mm,
Right. Are you going to lie to them about it? Or are you going to say, well, actually, this is a legacy of slavery as to why this is happening? Or, women make less because, you know, here's how patriarchy was structured, when the settlers got here. And it didn't have to be that way. If you look at the way indigenous communities were structured,
right.
um, a lot of the way resources were transferred over generations were matrilineal, not patrilineal, right? You start to learn that there are other ways to do things. And so I think that history gives people a more grounded perspective and therefore increases the likelihood that some of this respect and behaviors are going to be transferred outside of the workplace.
Well said. It's funny. I when reading your bio, and I noticed that you work for Pearson. I use a lot of Pearson books in the classes that I taught. Now I know why
Yeah.
they were so rich with information because you
Hey, I was just
probably touched
marketing, man.
it. All right.
There are
So
a lot of
listen.
smart people there.
So we are, as we begin to wrap up, our
Yep.
podcast is entitled Something to Say. And we always like to create this opportunity for those who are on the podcast to tell us what is it that you'd like to say. So we'll turn it over to you. What would you like to say?
Well, very simple. It's a plug. Go to DEIincontext.com. You can see the trailer that we put together to promote our first program, which is Patterns in American Racism. Our next series is American Patriarchy, looking at women's struggle for equality. And you can learn a little bit more about our perspective and why we think history is so important to DEI training. And I wish everybody could just respect each other, right? Take the time to listen, but also be critical. And I don't mean critical as in criticize. I mean critical as think critically about what you're hearing, verify things that don't make sense to you, even verify the things that do make sense to you. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there and disinformation out there. And if we're really going to get through this, I think we've got to reattach ourselves to the truth. I think we've become a little bit unmoored from the truth based on social media and also some of the institutions that we tend to believe in and accept have become a little less concerned with being accurate. And I think we have to take some of that responsibility to better discern the information that we consume,
Wow.
or discern between the information we consume.
Well, Patrice, it has been an amazing opportunity to speak with you. I knew that it was going to be insightful. I have to admit, one of the things that I found extremely enlightening in my conversation with you is that family connection and that historical understanding of who I am as a person and the contribution of those who are quite influential to me and how I look at the world and the things that I do. I mean, it exudes out of you. So, big shout out to you that. But more importantly, that the perspective that you have of the world is one that offers individuals a lot of hope. It offers individuals a lot of clarity. And I think, not to put a pun to it, but it helps to put things into context. And I think listening to you and the way that you speak, you do put things into context. So it has been a pleasure having you on our show, and I certainly hope we have an opportunity to do a part two.
I'm down. Thank you so much, man. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to talk some more.
So, audience, that's a wrap for this episode of Something to Say. We encourage you to stay tuned for more inspiring conversations from the voices of individuals from diverse backgrounds sharing their passions. So, until next time, this is Greg DeShiel signing off.
Thank you for tuning in to Something to Say. We trust you found some valuable insights and takeaways that can help you find your passion. Don't miss out on future episodes. Please subscribe, rate, and review us on your preferred platform. We value your feedback and suggestions, so let us know how we can serve you better. Keep the conversation going and stay inspired until we meet again. Take care and happy listening.